Hi everyone, welcome to Doing Sociology. Today we have Professor Rajni Palriwala with us, who has been my teacher during my MA days at Delhi School of Economics. So it's not just a privilege to speak to her, but also a bit intimidating. We are going to talk about care, gender, and the state. Very quickly introducing Professor Palriwala. Like I said, she is retired as a professor of sociology from the Department of Sociology, Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi in 2020. Her research interests include gender, kinship and marriage, care, citizenship and the state, feminist theory and politics, agrarian and development studies, and comparative sociology. She has authored several books. Changing Kinship, Family and Gender Relations in South Asia, Processes, Trends and Issues, and co-authored Care, Culture and Citizenship, Revisiting the Politics of the Dutch Welfare State. She has co-edited Marriage, Migration and Gender, Shifting Circles of Support, Contextualizing Kinship and Gender Relations in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and Structures and Strategies, Women, Work and Family in Asia. Professor Palriwala, I welcome you to Doing Sociology. Thank you so much for giving us this time. And we would like to begin our conversation by asking you about how care work has existed in all societies and how can we explain the recent focus by both academics as well as policymakers on care work.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rituparna, for thinking of this. Congratulations on this great initiative of yours. And before I address your question, I just maybe the introduction might have been a little out of date or old because I just wanted to mention a couple of other things which are relevant to what I'm talking about. One is the co-authored book on planning families, planning gender, looking at the adverse sex ratio in India. And the other is the co-edited book on marriage and migration. And I can't remember. Oh, well, and the other one, the co-edited book also on transformations in marriage in South Asia. Both of them in some different ways. I don't know if I'll have time, as well as the book on the adverse sex ratio, were things into which my care work, of course, and my work on family, kinship, gender fed in, and from which, again, I drew out. But to come to your question about whether care has existed in all societies, um, now, to address that question, one would first have to say, what do we mean by care? How do we conceptualize care? What is the definition of care? But yes, definitely, we'll see that care has existed in all societies, even though it may not always, within academics, have been named as such. And it would not have been in the same form all through history, across societies with the same parameters, values, relations, context, etc. Now, I say that it has existed in all societies, as I've said, we need at least a preliminary definition or conceptualization. And what we can say is care is necessary for life itself and for the social fabric. Because at a minimum, care is the work and personal interaction that ensures the daily and intergenerational maintenance of human beings. And this is drawn from an author, Evelyn Nakano Glenn, and I'll come back to her again later. Now, within that, one can again distinguish between direct care, which is person to person, physical, as well as emotional work and services, and indirect care. Without indirect care, you can't have direct care. And indirect care would be things like maintenance of a livable habitation, fostering of social relations, etc. So, in answering that question, what we see is that the entry point in conceptualizing care is that one, it is work, and it is work that is necessary for survival, continuity of life, and social reproduction. So, one of the things we see is that you will not have the social reproduction of any society and any system without care. And within social reproduction, at the same time, we need to differentiate various different levels of it. So there's the biological production of human beings. Okay. There is the social and cultural creation and rearing, which includes socialization, learning to labor, learning to live with others in society, as well as the cultural and social reproduction of immediate and society-wide relations and structures. Care feeds into all these three levels of social reproduction. Now, you may remember, you may have in your work on gender looked at Engels' work on origins of the family, private property, and the state. And Engels, at that time, drawing on Marx, and I want to quote him over here. He says the determining factor in history is, in the final instance, the production and reproduction of immediate life. This has a twofold character: the production of the means of existence, and two, the production of human beings. So this is something which he points out, and that it was true of all societies. Now, this was true of all societies, whether the production of the means of existence took place through community labor or slave labor, or through serfdom or so-called wage labor, or even under socialism. What the production of human beings brings us to, Engels points out to, is immediately the family system. So there is this suggestion that right from the early societies, care, the production of human beings, took place within family systems which have also changed. Now, we can also argue, and this is why at times the question of whether care has always existed comes up, because we think of care only in the terms of our present society. But what we can see is that at one time there was very little distinction between production and family systems and social reproduction. Now, you all may remember, for example, Salin's work on Stone Age economics, where you see that the community, the family, hunting and gathering, taking care was all within one domain as they moved. They were all what today we might call it the domestic domain. And this is one of the questions which one could take up, and can't go into detail. But where in societies where the domestic domain and the public domain were not so distinct. Okay. Now, even if private intimacy existed, like even under, one is in hunting and gathering societies, they weren't always distinct. And remember, hunting and gathering societies, we can't look at them as they exist today with all the modern interventions and things which have taken place, but in an earlier time. But even in feudal societies, you think of discussions of the king's household. The king's household was also a public domain. You see that also in work which has been done on ancient India. It was also a private domain. So, in a sense, the royalty had no privacy. But also, if you think of the peasants, okay, what happened within the home and within the field were not so distinct. And care took place in those domains. What we see is that it's as class society emerges, that the separation between these domains becomes sharper, and particularly under capitalism, these domains become very sharp. So there appears then a domain of unpaid domestic familial work and a domain of paid work. And what we then see is that the deployment as well as the ubiquity of the concept, first of unpaid domestic work and then of care, becomes sharper and clearer under capitalism, as production and reproduction apparently become separate. When the profit motive becomes paramount, social reproduction is apparently freed from the masters, and it's made a private responsibility of workers and their families. For a long time, as I've suggested, care and the reproduction of human beings, the reproduction of social relations, the daily maintenance of people were the responsibility of the family, but it was not completely left to them. Now it is within the family, and not just within the family, of course, it falls on women within the family. And this is due to the link with biological reproduction. Women were the bearers of children, breastfeeding was important. Early societies depended on reproduction of human beings. So women were critical in terms of not just their value, but their power. And what we then see is that care, in fact, was given a lot of value in those times. Women was given a lot of value. With capitalism, even though this is the work, the unpaid familial work, and I'll come to it then being named as care, but which is essentially care, even though it reproduces and maintains the labor force and hence is critical to its enterprises, the capitalist completely outsourced it to the family. And it becomes unpaid, unrecognized work. And within the family, because there's an apparent continuity with an earlier sexual division of labor. Yeah. But in fact, a sexual division of labor, which is not the same. This is often a mistake which is made, that because there's an apparent continuity, we assume it's the same sexual division of labor. But in fact, the values of the different works have changed, and as it feeds into other work, it changes. What do we have today then? We have a situation where this daily and intergenerational maintenance of family members, which, as I've said, we can take as being the core of care, and of human reproduction, are then cast as natural activities to meet natural biological needs. It doesn't require thought, apparently, doesn't require skill, and it's outsourced to the family, it's outsourced to women. They don't have, they will do this natural work. And it is something which, at the same time, the capitalist depends on it, that it will happen. Now, what we find is that then there are changes which take place. It still takes place within the family, but whereas within the early years of capitalism, and under neoliberalism now increasingly, the entire responsibility for the social reproduction of the work and the workforce can be left, or is left, to the family, to the work of the worker, to the worker and the worker's family. There were phases when capitalism required, in a sense, some sort of support and subsidy. And one can look at the phases of the welfare state in that regard. It both gave capitalism some support because it sort of underwrote some of the costs of the reproduction of the labor force, but it also meant help for workers. And what we find is that, okay, well, that's another discussion. How did welfare systems emerge? They emerged partly due to the threat of socialism, which was seen post the 1917 Russian Revolution, partly in response to the devastations in Europe after the World Wars. But what the welfare state did enable at the same time was some moves towards gender equality, some moves in terms of workers' rights, where the workers were, of course, already organizing and moving, and that's putting pressure, and that's why partly this emerged, and a reimagining of the family. The welfare state also enabled productivity to increase and their profits, and enabled more people to enter the labor market. Now, what we find under neoliberalism, and this becomes very important in terms of, I think we'd also ask the question, why is it that we talk about care today? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, I want to come to that part of the question now in terms of if care has always existed, why is it that we talk about it today? And much of this long historical thing which I'm giving you is also in order to address that question. Now, under neoliberalism, what happened again? The welfare state retracts. This was something which I saw in my work in the Netherlands. And increasingly, the social reproduction of the worker and the workforce in terms of that daily and intergenerational maintenance and socialization is put back entirely on the worker and the worker's family. Well, not entirely, because of course the education system and the training of people to be workers in the right places are still something which are outside the family. But basically, the responsibility shifts to from the individual employer or the capitalist class or state institutions back to the workers. But neoliberalism is also about ensuring maximum time and maximum extraction from the workers. So, how is that done? The welfare state retracts. Social protection and unionization are attacked. Real wages are held down so that all members will need to work again, like they had to in the early years of capitalism. And with globalization, you have a whole range of migrant workers who also come in and a new precariat which is formed. So, in other words, to repeat what I was saying, that with the responsibility of the employer or the state to provide facilities towards a minimum of care provisions and a decent life were also undermined. Because under unequally in different capitalist states, but under the welfare state, there would be certain provisions which went in which enabled care, decent housing, indirect care. Um, in terms of public schooling, in terms of maybe creche facilities, in terms of a minimum, in terms of food, etc. Now, a lot of these get cut. And as a result, what Glenn, whom I'd mentioned earlier, Evelyn Nicado, Glenn and others have called, they say a care crisis emerges. And it's that crisis in the provisioning of care which brings care onto the table for academics, for activists, and for policymakers. What is this care crisis? Earlier, it was limited to poor families, where they all had to, all members would try and go to work in order to earn enough. So it meant that there was a double burden on women who were the primary carers. They would be rushing, they would have to cut down on the care provided, they would have to cut down on the time spent in that, find all sorts of shortcuts. Or as studies have shown here in India, where women are left to care for themselves. I mean, sorry, children are left to care for themselves because the mothers have to go out to work and the fathers have to go out to work. And there may be, especially for migrant workers, there may be no other women, family members over them. But the care crisis comes onto the table for policymakers and for academics because it spreads beyond the poor. This is also a very important aspect. Even relatively affluent middle class families now experience a time bind, what she calls a time bind, and a stretch out in the efforts to meet the competing demands of income and caring. And this, of course, relates to the way in which there's a lot of discussion about how even those who are in very sort of apparently status jobs, they are almost expected to be 24/7 available for their employers. If you want a promotion, you have to work, 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 and then you get the promotion, etc. So women have to prove they're even better, and their responsibility remains on them for caring. So there's a care crisis. Now, to some extent, that care crisis may be filled by getting cheap migrant labor. Okay. But the cheap, so, okay, there's another aspect to it one has to also bring in. There was the welfare state and the retractions. There was also at that time the decolonization process and various social movements and the organizing of the workers. So this had pushed up wages. Okay. Now, initially, the wages, even for paid care workers, would have been very low. So it would have been difficult for middle class families to afford them in the West, not in India, of course, because here the wages for paid care workers is so low that most middle class families, and one finds even lower middle class families hiring them to an extent. But so the care crisis emerges because there's a competing demands of income and work, even amongst the middle class, relatively affluent. And until you have a flow of cheap migrant labor coming from elsewhere, they can't afford to hire care workers to take over that work. Now, also, during this period of so-called modernization and progress, there's been a lot of discussion and expansion on what care entails, what quality care entails. So, amongst the things you read about is how amongst middle class families, for mothers, it's not just cleaning and feeding and putting children to bed, etc., and seeing them off to school. They have to take them, sit and do homework with them. They have to take them for swimming classes or art classes or all sorts of other activities. They have to, in the middle classes in India, they have to learn how to bake and cook all sorts of new dishes, which is about also the sort of care you provide. They are supposed to spend a lot more time with children. Children can't just grow on their own, apparently, like they used to earlier. Now, this, and of course, the indirect care of home maintenance also becomes harder. And for the poor, of course, it's anyway very hard because the facilities and the infrastructure are so poor. If you're carrying water and you don't have proper electricity and you don't have gas stoves, etc., in any case, just the basic care becomes so much difficult. Now, another component in this care crisis, which is very critical, is that almost all countries have gone through the demographic transition, including India. Okay, which means the size of families has decreased. Okay, so the number of children has decreased. So on the one hand, time spent on the care of children would apparently decrease, but of course, as I've said, the demands of what is to be included in care has increased. But the other thing which is part of this is that there's been an aging population. So the care of the elderly has become an issue. And there's this whole sandwich generation, you can say, who are caught between looking after young children and aging kin also, parents. And if there are fewer children, then they have to look after maybe more parents and grandparents. So often you have people talking about how an only child and her partner is also an only child, and both of them then have the responsibility of four parents, okay, the parents of each, as well as their children. So this also meant a huge demand in terms of time. And if the parents weren't in the same location, then how do you work that out? How do you do it? So then is there lack of care? And, in India, institutionalized care is not seen as acceptable. And actually, in many parts of the Euro-American world, the elderly may prefer to be independent. But even then, a time may come when they aren't, and can they afford to be in an institution or not? Those issues also emerge. So this is how, in a sense, with the care crisis emerging, policy around care for the elderly, policy around what sort of training do you want of people in order for them to join the workforce? Policy around wages and healthcare and medical care and education, they all become part of the way the state has to think about care. And of course, in all this, a very important component in terms of the focus of care has been the women's movement and the feminist movement, where they have been saying that unpaid domestic work is work which falls on women, prevents equality and emancipation because it prevents them getting into equal paid work and getting economic independence. So amongst the things which then the feminists raised was, one is the renaming of, and I can come back to it, of unpaid domestic work as care itself was, in a sense, a political move as well as a policy move. Okay, we'll come to how, as soon as you say it's care, it's care. It's not just cleaning and cooking and all this routine work. It's care, so it gets a different resonance. And so then, as the crisis emerged, what were earlier demands of the women's movement again gets raised, and they raise a number of issues. Maybe we can come to it later, but I'll just mention them. One is the demand of a work-life balance. And it's very important. I have certain issues with the way that's framed, but that's another matter. But the other thing is they talk of the 4 Rs, that unpaid domestic work or care should be, first of all, recognized, it should be reduced, it should be rewarded, and it should be redistributed. Because unless it's redistributed, it still becomes part of the framing of women, women's responsibility, a limitation and constraint on women, however much women might love to do it, because we love spending time with children and all of that, okay? So what we see then is that care has always existed. The forms have changed. The changing in the forms is to do with a historical and political economy processes, which have also changed not just production but the family. And in the process of those changes, we see that they're both movements for emancipation as well as movements to enhance productivity and profits and control the workers, both lead to. Okay, you see, part of the care crisis, which we also have to keep in mind, is that more and more women enter paid work. Not in India. In India, paid work is still very low, but elsewhere they enter paid work. And since the responsibility remains on them, largely, that also leads to the care crisis, and then an issue within the movements. Okay, I think I've gone on too long on this issue. I'll stop here.
No problem. I think you've also answered some of the other questions I had, so that's completely fine. One thing that I wanted to ask is about how should we conceptualize care? And, can you also talk a little bit about what a care regime is? Because you're talking about this crisis of care. And how do we understand this in relation to capitalism?
Okay, right. That's a lot. Some of it I have addressed already. Now, in conceptualizing care work, as I've already sort of suggested, that we can that we can look at it in terms of the work which is required for the daily and intergenerational maintenance of people, of human beings. Okay, and that it is work that is necessary for survival and continuity of life and social reproduction, as I've already said. It has emotional components, it has physical components. Care requires direct person to person relationships. Now, a number of people have then, and as I've already said, mentioned to you, the conceptualization of care emerges first from an earlier conceptualization of unpaid domestic work in the home and the sexual division of labor. So I've written a paper which came out in 2019, which traces sort of four trajectories of how the concept of care emerges. And I can give you that reference and you can look at it. But most care work, as I've already indicated, falls into the broad area of what we call reproductive labor. Okay, rearing and socializing children, production and daily maintenance of human beings, etc., etc. Partly to one of the things which emerges when we could say that we're going to conceptualize care is that actually care is work, and like all work, it takes place in relations. So to conceptualize care, we have to think in terms of care relations. And there's another scholar called Tronto, a political philosopher, who suggests, along with another, also what was her name, Nelson, initially two of them do it together and then Toronto, four phases of care. And this becomes particularly important when we look at how care has this sort of moral tone and, it's very good and the state takes it on. And the four phases of care which he talks about is firstly thinking about care. Okay, that has the most status. And that is something which the state, for example, will do. Okay. Just 1 minute. I'm just thinking. Okay. So, there's these four phases of care. One is, as I said, the thinking of care, which is where the most got most status, got most power. The second is provisioning care. Because remember, this daily maintenance of human beings, etc., can't take place unless we also provide for care. And this is where the production system becomes important within the care domain. Okay. The materiality of care, that's something which very often gets forgotten, and I'll come back to it. It's very important in how one conceptualizes care. Materiality of care is at different levels. One is the provisioning. Provide, food has to be brought in. So if women are torn between earning an income and hands-on care, it's because hands-on care is not possible if there's no income, if there are no livelihoods. Okay. The third phase, and the one focuses on most when we are talking about care, and whether it's the care economy or whatever, is caregiving. And caregiving brings us at once to the direct person to person relationship between the carer, the labor of the carer, and the recipient, the care receiver. And caregiving in most societies has the least status, least power, and least value, so income, etc. And the relations, then what we see is the care relations vary tremendously from society to society. So when we conceptualize care work, we should actually move in the direction of trying to conceptualize care relations. Now, in order to do this, we also have to, like with any definition or concept, as you would have realized, you have to draw boundaries. There are things which you have to leave outside that concept, outside that care, to make it something which is productive to analysis. Because I said, care is essential for survival and life. So, but it's not the whole of survival and life. If it is, then why talk about care at all? So things come up. For example, we can't survive without sleep. Is sleep care? I would argue and most the early sort of discussions have said no. You leave sleep out of care because we go into work and the expenditure of energy. Care requires the expenditure of energy. What about self-care and self-maintenance? There's a lot of discussion today. Well, not a lot of discussion, but there are people who would suggest that, oh, but self-care and self-maintenance is also care work. And if you go into Foucault actually only talks of the only care he really talks about is self-care. But it's a very different context, a very different domain, and he's talking about how actually human beings get made and in a certain time. Now, if we say care has to be in terms of care relations, and we can say, okay, it's a relationship with myself, but I still think that it will not help us go further in understanding care as work and as relations. And, you've asked the concept about the idea of care regimes. We'll come to it. Now, one problem which may come up there, they'll say, oh, are you making the same mistake as was made with unpaid work? That because capitalism doesn't value unpaid work, that's why it wasn't valued, and now self-care is sort of also about relationships with others and people. Yeah, but then all emotional relations aren't care. You see, that's the other thing. Because emotion is a component of care, there's also, one might say, okay, anything which is about an emotional relationship is care. And again, one will have to work out an argument as to why it is care or it is not care. And essentially, emotion in the context of caregiving, one will take as being care work. Is a cultural worker a care worker? Because, your mobile theater certainly enhanced the quality of our lives. But do we then think of them as care workers? Are cultural workers all to be equated there? Is a musician, because he improves my emotional state, he enhances my emotional state, to be taken as a care worker? I would argue that those are areas which one has to exclude from our conceptualization of care. Now, maybe one is taking survival to its bottommost rung. Okay, but bottommost rung within a context, within a society. And this is where, when you say, how does it relate to capitalism? It's, as I suggested earlier, care changes from society to society. And under capitalism, and under most class societies, care is differentiated. Okay, it is. I told you it's about social reproduction. So care is also about reproducing the class system. Okay, but most importantly, for the capitalists, the workers have to be reproduced. Because if you don't have workers, however much, even if you get big, I don't know, I don't know enough about AI, but even if you get to AI, you need the workers who will work on AI, who will produce AI. Even as we move to more and more of a digitalized economy, you have the workers who have to code the software. Okay, even as we move to more automatic machines, you need the workers for that. And they all require further training. They need to be maintained for a longer time. They need to be, their daily maintenance, while they focus on that, becomes also an issue. So for capitalists also, it's a particular way in which the labor force has to be reproduced and then allocated within its enterprises. Now, one of the problems we have over here, and I won't go into it for long, as I said, we include things in care and we exclude. One of the problems with all us, with the social sciences and in sociology, is, of course, our concepts derive from our everyday language. The term, not the content of the concept, but the term. Okay. So care. Okay. Now, class. We know that the classroom, the class in the school or the college is not the same as social classes. Okay. But there will be a tendency to make them come together. It's like with women. When you're doing gender studies, you'll have found constantly meet someone and says, oh, why do you need to study it? I live with women. I am married to a woman. I have given birth to women. So I already know all about it. Because one is you live in it, so you think you know, and you will know some parts of it because of your everyday lives. But the term is not the same. And with care in particular, in the English language, it has so many different connotations. There is a tendency that people will then try and bring everything into care. Anyway, we can come back to this later. Let me come to your question about the care regime. From what I've said about care, I think one thing which will emerge is that in every society, in every social formation, there is, you could say, structures, relations and structures of care provision and caregiving, which are necessary for social reproduction and for that society. Now, at the same time, what we have to be careful of is taking regime to be fixed, because societies actually can only reproduce if there is flexibility within those structures, within those relations, within those regimes. So similarly with care regimes. Now, there were scholars who actually, the idea of care regime emerged first by when people were looking at welfare states and welfare regimes. And it was, the welfare state and welfare regimes were a product of social democracy, largely in Western Europe. And along with workers' movements and women's movements, they fed into it, as I've already said. Okay. Now, scholars then, looking at the welfare regime, produced various typologies of the welfare regime. And one of them, Esping Anderson, I'm not going to go into the details of his typologies, but essentially what he suggested was that within the welfare regime, the welfare regime was also grounded in an ideology of producing greater rights and equality for the workers, of decommodifying labor, because there would then be these welfare provisions which would come into it, defamiliarizing labor, because workers could turn to state provisions and not look at that, not depend on the family only. And this was an expansion of citizenship. Okay. Feminists pointed out that in much of this analysis, what was the situation of women was not looked at, because women, even as workers, were not defamiliarized. They had the responsibility of uh, unpaid care work in the home. Their access to citizenship as paid workers was limited, because their access as paid workers was access to paid work was limited. They pointed out that in all of these, although the welfare state in where it developed also played a major role in enabling women to enter the paid work economy, okay, as workers in welfare state institutions, etc. That's what you find in the Euro-American world. And India, it's a different story. I don't know, we can see if we can go into it, but of course, the state was the major avenue for women's employment in India too, even though women's employment in India and paid employment remains amongst the, very, very low, sort of amongst the lowest in South Asia and, equivalent to other low employment rates. Now, what we find is in the Indian context, then, of course, is that in any case, women's labor hadn't been commodified. Even when they were in productive work, it was often in family enterprises as unpaid workers. Okay. And of course, within the family also, they weren't commodified. So, decommodification had very little meaning for them. And women in India in particular have remained within the grips of the family. And we'll see, I'll talk about that a little bit more. They've remained embedded and dependent on the family. Now, what those feminist scholars then suggested was that underlying any welfare regime is a care regime. And I've not gone into the typologies of the welfare regime. And socialism was, of course, supposed to go beyond a welfare state to be that socialism would enable welfare in any case. But we leave that aside. But that underlying all of them was a care regime. And all welfare states, in other words, also capitalism, carried implicit and explicit ideas of care and caring practices, which led to a gendered lack of choice of workers and individuals. And there's a whole range of feminist economists, largely Marxist feminist economists, but not just Marxist feminist economists, who looked at this. They pointed out that with the emergence of capitalism, the male breadwinner model had been strengthened. Okay. The welfare state may have weakened the male breadwinner model, but it hadn't weakened the female caregiver model. Okay. So remember the care crisis, partly because women may also become breadwinners, but they remain the caregivers. And what they pointed out was that even within developed welfare states, it was only as the women's movement and the feminist movement grew further and the care crisis emerged that provisions like paid parental leave emerged. And in some cases, the cash for care schemes, but that again is a different thing, or family compensation payments emerged. Now, to understand what a care regime is in any of these, and especially under neoliberal capitalism, but otherwise also, another scholar, Jensen, said there are three questions we can ask if we want to map the care regime. Who cares? Who pays for the care? And how and where is that care provided? And when we ask those questions, those three questions, what we find is that under capitalism, particularly neoliberal capitalism, but under most welfare systems, the person who cares is still largely family labor. of poorly paid workers, or when they are paid care workers, paid, as one of the things which also emerged was a care economy, paid care workers who are part of the precariat. Okay. Who pays for it? The family, the worker, particularly with the retraction of the welfare state. Where is it done? Within the family, but also outside. And one of the things we then find emerging is that actually, if we want to understand the care regime, it is in terms of these three questions, but also in terms of care practices and care relations, we then can map it out in terms of the care diamond. Now, that's what another scholar called Shahra Razavi conceptualized as part of a big project, the UNRIST project on the political and social economy of care, which was the work I was within that, and I and another scholar, Neeta, did the India component of that work. And what you find then when you look at it in terms of the care diamond, what is the care diamond? It's pointed out there are 4 institutional corners which feed into how care is done and what we might call the care regime. The family, the market, the state, and the community or the NGO sector. And in different societies and in different contexts, these 4 institutions interact, but in different ways. Okay? And one can take it further and say that there is no one care diamond for any one society, because this also varies with class, with location, etc. Now, what we find in the Indian context is that the family is the most important institution. You then have some bit in terms of the market, which is particularly important for the middle classes and the elite and the growing care economy, a much smaller component by the state, and the community and NGO sector, much smaller. The community and the NGO sector, of course, is also a product of neoliberalism. But community provided care and assistance was there without it. And again, there are studies which show that how with migration, the lack of community becomes a problem in care for children, but it's still drawn on. But essentially, what you see is that the costs of care are covered largely by the family, very little by the state, from family earnings. And furthermore, even where there were responsibilities on the employers, through hard-won struggles of workers. For example, employers had to provide creche facilities. Employers had to give maternity leave, etc. The recent labor codes, which the government has increased, 4 labor codes, and I'm not going into the details of that, other than to say that that has shifted the care regime further back on women and the family, because the provisions, the responsibility of employers to provide creche facilities, etc., has got reduced because the floor level that you have to employ so many workers has moved from 50 to 100, if I remember correctly. Now, in this, of course, in the Indian context, what we also have to keep in mind is that the care regime, particularly in terms of the care economy, also has class and caste components and religious components. In what sense? Care, certain types of care we consider as polluting and not to be done by all, and it will be left on people who are seen as polluting. They will be the most poorly paid. Or there will be families who consider themselves very upper caste, and they will separate the care workers they have, those who will do the cleaning and those who will do the cooking. But also, given the inequalities in terms of the way class and caste and location and religion feed into the inequalities in terms of access to education and thence to employment, and particularly public sector employment, it also means that some of the provisions within from the state in terms of care is not available. And of course, the state is also violates its own rules. Many of the government offices don't have crash facilities. Despite the provisions now for childcare leave and parental leave, women still have to fight for. But there is some possibility of that. But essentially, in the Indian context, it's not just that care falls on women. The care regime is imbued with an ideology of gendered familialism. Okay, the best care will be provided within the home by women. So those who can afford to will also hire workers to come in and provide care. So the middle class and the elite who could have pushed that, oh, can we have good quality institutional childcare? Won't do it because they prefer that they get the workers at home. And, this is one of the things also, if you look at policy and politics, the middle class is very important in pushing some of these. Yeah. Is there, I think it's clear, but maybe in terms of what I've said on this, there's some clarification you want?
Yes. Could you also talk about how the state, whether it plays a role in institutionalizing care regimes?
Well, as I've indicated already, it does. As I've said, the care regime comes through if one looks at it in terms of the care diamond and in terms of those three questions, who cares, who pays, and where and how is it done? In different societies, the state has different role. And in the Indian context, it has an direct and an indirect role. See, one of the aspects of the care regime in India, which I could talk of, where you see the state directly coming in, is the state, we have we have a patchwork welfare state. Okay. It started off as universal and then became limited. We then had all sorts of other sort of pullbacks on our welfare state. But amongst the things which became very important was the state, starting from our national movement, and then subsequently with the many 5-year plans, etc., the state had the responsibility to remove poverty, to provide facilities to ensure a decent standard of living, to further equality, to further the strengthening of a social fabric which gave respect and dignity to everyone. And what we find when we look then at the state in terms of the care regime in India, as I said, there's direct and there's indirect. Indirect is, in terms of what I've already suggested, the disciplinary power of the state, okay, particularly in terms of the modern state and governmentality. And there we find that despite all the talks of the empowerment of women, policies around gender assume what I've called gendered familialism. That whatever else happens, women will be the providers of care and will be the core of the family. Okay. And that care can't be given too much value because then women might say, oh, okay, we should get more. Now, in this, remember, the state in India is not some neutral arbiter out there. As in sociology, we have learned, we have moved away from that sort of idea of the state. The state is distinct from society, but very much tied into and dependent and emergent with the structure of society, with class relations, with caste, etc. So, in upholding, but not just upholding, in producing the ideology of gendered familialism, the state is tying into dominant caste and class ideologies also. Okay. Now, on the one hand, there is almost a global consensus, you can say, in India and everywhere, that familial care is the best care. But you could have familial care which is not necessarily falling on women, where there is some facilities provided for it in particular ages, for example, maybe in between the ages of 0 and 2. But again, that global consensus can also be questioned. Now, so one is, as I said, the disciplinary power of the state in upholding this ideology, and which you can see constantly if you look at primary school textbooks, if you look at what people say, what politicians say, what policies, etc., have. In all of that, you have this ideology being pushed. But there is a duality. Because, as I've said, there is this history of the national movement, of the idea of enabling equality, respect, and dignity, ongoing social movements also, which come in our very constitution and the fundamental rights within the constitution. So, on the one hand, all of this, the state institutions will say, should rest on the traditional family. But they also realize that actually maybe some changes are required if we are going to remove poverty. And the integrated child development scheme, which was the flagship program since, I think it was 1975 it was started, the largest program in the world anywhere for provision to provide nutrition, to fight against malnutrition, and nutrition for whom? For pregnant women, for new mothers, and for children up to the age of 6. Now, these were based on what were called Anganwadis. Anganwadis are like creches. You will have seen them in Assam also. Now, the thing about the Anganwadis are 2 or 3 very interesting things. And you see how the state then institutionalizes the care regime in particular ways. One is that the creche part is only for children aged over 2. So 0 to 2, you don't have creche facilities. So if those children are going to access the nutrition which is to be given, either the mothers have to take them and bring them back, so they can't be going off to work, or your Anganwadi workers have to bring the children and take them back, or take the food to their homes. Who are the Anganwadi workers? The state classifies them not as workers, but as volunteers. And they get a stipend which is less than even the official minimum wage. Okay. But these Anganwadi workers not only have to provide give this sort of food supplements, vitamin supplements, etc., to all these women and to these children, They have to keep records of all the pregnant women within their Anganwadi area, how they are doing. And every time the state wants to conduct some special survey, the Anganwadi workers are sent off. So they end up actually working all through the day. Half the time, they're not able to even give those supplements because they're busy filling in registers. And what also happens, so part of the discussion which went on was that, okay, the Anganwadis can also provide early childhood education. And the studies to show where children have gained access to early childhood education in the creches, they have done better in schools. But the Anganwadi workers may not be trained for it. If they're trained, they're not left with time to do it. But it is, so what do you see in being institutionalized there? Apparently, care outside the home for children, but with people who are not classed as workers, who may be trained, but who are constantly being taken away from there. So mothers complain that, we can't leave our children there because the Anganwadi worker is not there. She's gone off somewhere else. And she can't do it. The ICDS scheme has been constantly expanded and renamed. Now, the present government, the present regime has set up this thing called Poshan. And Poshan sort of piggybacks on this and is supposed to be more focused on the micronutrients of diet and nutrition, especially for pregnant, lactating women. But the other part of when we look at how the state regime feeds into care, what we find in the Anglo or Euro-American world, you have the retraction of the welfare state. Here, we don't have a retraction in name. I mean, we don't have programs being folded up directly. What we have is that, okay, 5 programs will be merged into one. And the funding for that will not be of all the 5. The funding for the ICDS, now URF Poshan program, has been decreasing from budget to budget, even as expenses increase. The ICDS scheme is supposed to be like the Manrega scheme, partly funded by state governments, partly funded by the central government. Central government has been cutting its components. So what happens is that this area of possible child care is being reduced, of state-provided child care, of non-domestic care is being reduced. The other aspects of this, when you look at in terms of the state's role in terms of a care regime, so primary education, you could say, is very important in terms of a care provision and hence of care regime. There's some people will argue that, oh, should we be talking about primary schools as care provision? But let us say that in terms of the intergenerational maintenance and reproduction of people, schooling has become more and more important in modern societies. And the primary school is of children at an age where they do need also care. School hours may be cut, but more importantly, public schooling. The government is going in for more and more privatization of education. Okay? And, they're merging schools in Assam. There's this whole thing of, I was reading of primary schools being merged because, there are no children there. Now, why are there no children there? If you reduce the quality of the school, or say only so these children can go there, or you don't have teachers, or not enough teachers, children won't go there. Or you take away the transport for children to go to those schools, they won't go there. So, in other words, in terms of the care regime, the state has a very important role to play, particularly in a context of India, where you have the levels of unofficial poverty, let's say, because of course the government's poverty line is so low that those who can't afford private transport, private schools, etc., will not will still may not come under the poverty line. Now, because of the poor quality of government schools, people spend all their money on sending their children to private schools, which may not be any better. Okay. The government then, in terms of funding, as well as their indirect, that disciplinary practice of the state, okay? The disciplinary power is what? It's pushing them towards accessing private facilities or turning it in, doing it in the home. Okay. Again, old age care, if you look at it, there are now schemes, but one is the old age pension, which the state provides, which is pretty low, or a pension to old widows, which is pretty low. But the other is that they say supposed to have institutional provisions also, but it's largely only on paper. Other part of it is medical care. And with the privatization of medical care, of course, again, it comes on the home, but not only that, there's a long documentation of the huge shortage of nurses in hospitals in our country. And medical care is not only by doctors, nurses are important. There won't be nurses, family members have to be there to take care of the patient, even in the hospital. And again, nurses are so badly paid that the nurses who are trained go off. They get slightly better paid in private facilities, and if they can, they migrate. Okay, so you induce a shortage of medical care and turn it into poor quality familial care. That's another way this happens. There's another program which the state has started, which is important. Of course, there's the midday meal scheme of providing food in schools. Again, they aren't workers, they are volunteers, they don't have to be paid a full wage. And again, as far as I recall, I can't remember exactly, I think the budgetary allocation over there has also reduced. And a lot of poor families were sending their children to school largely because of the meal. But as a result, children also got access to education. The midday meal scheme was so important in pushing up in gross enrollment rates. And as the midday meal scheme collapses, those are also falling. Then there are also schemes like the ASHA workers and I'm forgetting, in terms of ANMs, auxiliary nurse midwives. Auxiliary nurse midwives have a little better status than the ASHA workers. The ASHA workers it's almost like they are paid piece rate. How many women did you bring for formal delivery? Okay, you get paid maybe 50, 100. It's increased a bit. With no assistance in terms of security. Stories of ASHA workers having to go in the middle of the night to take a woman for delivery and being attacked, harassed in terms of the transport facility that they're getting. So we see both direct and indirect ways in which then the state provides and does not provide care, privatizes care, reinforces gendered familialism, reinforces and where it's not that the state doesn't have funds. So there one would actually, if one wanted to look at it, one would have to look much more carefully over some years at budgetary allocations. And that can be a very interesting study, which also a sociologist can do. Look at the budgetary allocations in terms of these different sectors, and then pick up one or two of these particular sort of initiatives of the government and see what's happening. As some people have also pointed out, what's also important is the ICDS is called a scheme. Now, there's a language over there. A program is something which will remain. A scheme is something which can be withdrawn and which is always limited. Yeah, I think that's what I would have to say on this.
Ma'am, so should we continue or are you exhausted?
I guess we could continue. It's 1:30, nearly 1:30. We can continue. I don't know. Let's see. When I'm feeling I no longer can talk, I'll tell you, okay, enough.
Okay, all right. So, I think you have answered a lot of questions that we had in terms of already explaining things. However, one question that we probably should talk a little more about is about emotional labor and how it is often used for work done in the service sectors like care work.
Hmm.
And how can we explain this as part of or not of the tendency to separate the realms of the instrumental and affective?
Okay. Now, the idea of emotional labor was, of course, developed by the sociologist, anthropologist Hochschild, who's done a lot of amazing work on many different aspects of it. And what we see is, starting from her book on the managed heart and a lot of other things, immediately the names don't come to me. Emotional labor is, first of all, something which is labor that requires one to induce, and this is her definition, I think, yeah, requires one to induce or suppress feelings in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in the other. Okay. In other words, it's the management of feeling to create a publicly observable display of emotions. And she's talking about professionals. So that is required for a job in a professional or service sector setting. But it's also required in the home or in the intimate context. Think about it. A mother who will suppress the fact that she is very stressed or that there's a lot of conflict between her and the father of the child so that the child does not get upset. Okay. That's also emotional labor. Okay. Now, is the fact that she is consciously doing it and she's doing it in a way which is both instrumental and effective, then reducing the value of that emotion? That actually, so emotional labor is rooted, first of all, let us be very clear, in the idea of the separation of the instrumental and the emotional. Okay. In the separation of, we can say, of the objective and the subjective. And the subjective being in terms of values, ideas, and practices. But if we look at the sociology and anthropology of emotion and effect, what we need to see is that emotion and effect are not just natural responses to situations. They're not just sort of visceral effects, emotional effects, visceral effects or hormonal effects. Emotions are also socially and culturally made in relationships. They are, for example, another example, a woman likes this young man, but she doesn't see that response. she will consciously maybe work at eliciting that response, getting him to see her in a particular way. So it's not just that it's just naturally going to come. You work at it, or the man does it, he speaks in a certain way, he takes the woman out, or the woman takes the man, does it. Emotions are produced in relationships, and they're socially and culturally produced also. Emotions appropriate in one culture are not appropriate in another. Emotions appropriate in one context are not appropriate in another context. And there's one view which takes emotions as being sort of universal natural facts. They're neurophysical changes in the human body, and emotions are like drives, like instincts, sensations, biological experiences, which psychologists and biologists will map. There is one anthropologist called Leavitt, and he does this very interesting study. I think it's in set in what is now Uttarakhand or Himachal. And what he argues is that this universalist view you also find in anthropology, okay, in symbolic and cultural anthropology. And that there is this assumption that the observer is able to immediately understand the emotion of the other because it's universal. And he argues the opposite. He argues what I'm arguing just now, that emotions are culturally and socially constructed, experienced, and cognized. Emotion is not just feeling, but also meaning. Okay? And meaning means the mind is coming in. Cognition is coming in. And it is then within the context. So if emotion is about both the mind and sort of instinctive feeling, okay, instrumental and effective aren't so far apart. But yes, in context, the instrumental becomes more important. A good nurse, I've talked about the good mother. We talk about a doctor with a good bedside manner. He may be totally uninterested in the patient, but he shows interest. A good nurse also may be thinking, oh God, this patient is so demanding. But if she shows it, the patient will get upset and she will be seen as being a bad nurse. So that instrumental part has to come in. And basically, what Hochschild pointed out was that all emotional labor is guided by feeling rules, okay, by emotional conventions. And what this means is that emotion is performed, it's done according to these feeling rules. We act it out in everyday life, in intimate life, in public life. The idea of giving a flower as an expression of love. We've seen that being used in different anthropological texts to talk about different things. Giving that flower doesn't necessarily mean love, but it's become part of the convention. And then there will be somebody who will say, oh, he never gave me flowers. And he gave her flowers, which shows that he loves her more rather than me. That song, which is a lovely song. What's her name? That singer, I Can Give Myself Flowers.
I'm not very good with
Um,
singers.
this is an American singer. Oh, you must listen to this song. It's very catchy. So that's about self. She's, of course, singing about self care. But anyway, now the thing is that in the service sector in particular, work a lot of work is based on interpersonal interaction. It may be fleeting, it may be momentary, it may be longer. So the delivery boy is, very short. But we still will think of that person who has brought us the food with a smile. The electrician okay, who speaks to us well, we will remember that person because and call that person again, maybe. Okay. So in the service sector, this is what is important, why emotional labor comes in, is because interpersonal interaction is at the core of the work there, between the client and the worker, between the customer and the consumer, between the patient and the nurse, etc. And elements of subjectivity and affect then become central to the experience. In the service sector, as much as in others, physical labor is very important. Okay. But the relationships in which you work are immediate. Okay. In the manufacturing sector, the immediate relationships will be with your fellow workers or with your employer, with your supervisor, etc. And there too, the nature of interaction will ask for particular sorts of emotional content. You would think in terms of even a university department. In your, you're frightened of me because of the way I presented myself as a teacher. Now, I won't go into why I worked very hard at that, scaring you all off, but it's, part of it. But forget the student teacher thing. In terms of your colleagues, even if you'll have very little to do, even if you're really irritated with another colleague, you know that you'll have to be instrumental about it and not show it in order to maintain a good work atmosphere. So one shouldn't diss the separation between the instrumental and the emotional. But of course, there is a problem if the instrumental completely governs the emotional in personal relations. Okay. And then that becomes a different thing. But emotional labor aims to produce feeling and meaning. And the rules are such that it's rules which are appropriate to context, relationship, hierarchies. They produce hierarchies also. So people get very upset if the clerk gets too familiar with you. So that familiarity is about a subjective understanding. It produces certain feelings in you and in that person. So it's hierarchies are also produced over there. Now, what Hochschild, of course, points to is that in the service sector and for professional workers, there is this question of surface acting, what she calls, and deep acting. And surface acting is where you can just apparently act it out. And certain professions allow you to just do surface acting, but others may require deep acting. And then those professions, like the air hostess who is good in her job, she discusses them, is probably doing deep acting. And at surface acting may give way quickly to anger at this very demanding passenger. In terms of, now the thing is in care, because it is interpersonal relations, and whether it's paid care or unpaid care, there's a direct intimacy between the persons. Even if it's sort of now increasingly the idea that it can be provided digitally, the subjective and affect immediately come into play. And also very often, of course, emotions and affect may be the motivation to give care. Okay, you love your child, so because of that, even though you're completely exhausted, you may provide care. Of course, at times we also know that for mothers, the exhaustion gets too much and they cannot give that care. But that will not be recognized. She'll be seen as being unnatural. But the fact that that emotion did not lead her to give care, to sacrifice herself, to do everything, But emotion is one of the emotions. And of course, emotion and affect is also one of the outcomes of care. Because you may love your carer or hate your carer. You may only later on come to think, I was cared for so badly and I'm now traumatized because of what happened in that time and in those years. You find lots of narratives in terms of studies of old age homes, for example, where the elderly feel uncared for, even though all the physical tasks have been taken care of. They've been, food is provided, cleanliness is there, they're taken for the walk, etc. But they feel uncared for because they feel the carer does not really respond to them as a person, does not smile at them. Okay. And often that extra bit requires more time, and the carer may not have the time, or the elderly person cannot pay for more time. So the emotional component in physical care becomes then important. But if it's only emotion and the materialities of care are not provided, and the instrumental reasoning in terms of what's required is not there, then also the person will be cared and feel uncared for. Oh, she comes and smiles and laughs at me, but she doesn't bother to change my bed sheets. Or she tells me, okay, we'll do it later. Or she brings the food late, and then she'll pass it off as a joke. So the thing is that neither can we search, the search for some authentic emotion, uncontaminated by reason or instrumentality, is a false search. Another reason why that's very important is people will suggest that, paid care can never be as good as familial care. Because familial care, there's genuine emotion. And in paid care, there cannot be the genuine emotion. Yeah, the emotion won't be the same. The affect won't be the same. But what we also know is that affective relationships may develop, but also if that basic physical care is provided with thought and in terms of what is needed and the outcomes, it induces that emotional state, which is good. Yeah, I think, there's a lot more to say about this, but it's difficult to talk about all of that.
Yeah, I think it's such a vast topic, and to talk about each aspect is difficult. It requires an hour by itself. Last question, Professor Palriwala. There are some studies now suggesting that more men are also joining care work. So, what do you say about that?
See, there's two or three aspects to it. The time utilization studies, which in India, one was a large 20,000 households, but still small relative to, it was considered a sort of pilot survey. And then in 2019 and in 2024, doesn't show that on average, men are doing more in terms of care work. Okay? There is not much change. However, there may be differences, and there were always differences in terms of by class and by caste and by location, etc. So yes, there's a section of within the middle classes of men who will say that they want equality and they want women to have equality, and they will come in to also help with the work. Or men who may be working from home while the wife is going out and they may be doing some work. Those are narratives which are very nice. They are very few. They can they can provide good role models, but they are very few. Furthermore, even if we take it wider, you will see that there was always, for a long time, men have been doing some of what we might call care. Okay, so playing with children, that's also care. And men and fathers, grandfathers, elder brothers have for a long time played with children. But did they clean up the shit and clean out the rooms, etc.? Very rarely, very rarely, if at all. And there are n number of studies which have shown that. Many of the studies I'm thinking of, it's true, from maybe a decade back or even 2 decades back, but there's nothing in the recent TUS which suggests that has changed. Another aspect which we have to keep in mind is that there was always some sharing of care work, depending on how we defined it. Sometimes to do with caste rules. So, amongst certain upper castes, because of rules of purity and pollution, during the menstrual cycle, women were not supposed to go into the kitchen to cook because the good food would be offered to the gods. Okay, amongst this is a Brahmanical idea. If that was a family which couldn't afford paid care workers, and a lot of Brahmins couldn't, the men, and there was no other woman in the home, which was also possible, the man would have to cook and feed after the cook, then the woman could take over and feed the child, and she would still do all the cleaning. But there were also various tasks which, for example, with migration, poor families who have migrated, per force, it may become necessary for men to take on some time of this, to look after the child for some time, if because they need a double income. I've suggested that. So there are those sorts of shifts which have taken place. But at an aggregate level and an average, one finds very little move. At the same time, clearly, the idea of sharing and redistribution is very much part of the discourse and the discussions amongst the middle classes. But unfortunately, again, many of those who will talk about how we believe in equality for women will suddenly disappear when it comes to certain not very valuable work being done. Another element in this which we have to keep in mind is that families often have to make a choice. So, given the inequalities in access to work and high paid work, and that men have better access, you will often find that even if men wanted to, they have to continue to work. The and then so the woman will be the one doing the housework. Take childcare leave. Okay. Again, it's primarily women who will get the work. It's not even there on the table for men. And of course, some people say, even if men get the childcare leave, will they actually be with the children? Of course, since most parents also take childcare leave when they are middle class parents, when the children are going to do 10th and 12th board exams, there at least the father could contribute. So again, one needs much more detailed studies across different classes, different castes, different regions, different religions, and with a very nuanced understanding of what care work is, of unpaid household work. What one finds is that in the Indian context, for the middle classes, where this might happen most easily, it's much easier to hire workers. And then the supervision remains on the woman, because otherwise you could say, okay, we'll hire the workers, but you supervise. The man should supervise, decide what will be cooked, make sure that all the vegetables, okay, they'll buy the vegetables, etc., maybe. But the class and caste inequalities in our society actually can underwrite a lack of shift in the gendered distribution of care work and housework. Yeah, I think I'll stop on that.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am, for giving us so much time and talking about care work in such great details. I'm hopeful that our young viewers, particularly people who are preparing maybe to work on their PhD research, get some insights, go back and read some of these texts that you have mentioned, as well as your works, to become more knowledgeable about this subject. And thank you so much, Professor Palriwala, once again.
Not at all. Thank you. As I said, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about this. And actually, since it is work which I've researched, which is in different ways I have done for the last 30, 40 years, there's always a lot to say. But yes, I am rather tired. So even though I can think of, oh, we should have talked about that, or we should have talked about that, not possible. And actually, if this is meant to be um, for young scholars thinking in terms of PhD, they have to really do their own readings. And, there is a long list of my work, but also the various scholars whom I've mentioned. They can look at their work and many more whom I've not mentioned. There's a huge scholarship around care now. So, and in fact, people question why that huge scholarship, as you asked also, but in a different way, you asked it. So, yeah, and there is, despite that huge scholarship, many areas where we need good empirical work, ethnographic work, qualitative and quantitative work. And one thing I need to say in this over here is that care work and looking at care really requires, if you're going to look at it empirically and ethnographically, in terms of everything I've said, you'll realize it requires that the researcher is very sensitive to nuances and to his or her interlocutors and participants. Okay, so good work can be produced if a good research is designed and done.
Yes,
Yeah.
and thank you so much for that.
Okay, thank you, Rituparna.